So welcome to our final discussion of Kant. First hour, before we have a break, we'll read what we can from the canon of pure reason, which is the point of the book. We've dipped into a few passages in the critique of pure reason, and now that is the limitation of its use, and now we get an exposition of its proper use, which is not in theory. There is no theoretical pure reason. We cannot know anything more than the results of modern natural science, i.e. there's stuff moving about in space, absolutely without any notion of better or worse or anything like that. Exactly what Hume says when he means that you cannot get any ought from what is, and Kant plays on that when he says you can derive an intelligible order of morality from what is the case, because what is the case is that every human being senses that there is a moral command upon their behaviour. And we'll read passages where he discusses this. Now, let's look at the text. So this first hour, we will look at the text as much as possible, then we'll have a break. I'm going to make a couple of highly rhetorical suggestions about Kant's significance, and we can just have as open a discussion as possible. So that's the wrong text. Okay, this is the beginning of the second chapter of the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, and this is the chapter called the Canon of Pure Reason. And I just want to read a couple of lines here before we jump to our main reading, which is section 2 of the Canon of Pure Reason. So first, just these first lines on page 8, B823 in the text. It is humiliating for human reason that it accomplishes nothing in its pure use, thus far, theoretically, and even requires a discipline to check its extravagances and avoid the deception that comes from them. So just as a reminder, our rationality has fundamentally two aspects: the understanding, which provides the concepts by which we recognize or perceive the natural world, i.e. everything in space and time moving according to natural laws. That's the concepts of the understanding. So that means the theoretical significance of our world is constructed by the understanding itself. Now, the other faculty is reason, which uses concepts and infers from concepts, but it has no direct contact with the material world. Now, the peripeteia here and the main aspect of the Copernican revolution, which is that we do not ask that our mind reflect the object, but rather that the object is a reflection of the constructive constituting activity of the mind, is that pure reason is going to constitute the object that gives significance to all of the rest of science. Now, but to do that, we have to have this discipline first. So the first part of the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, chapter 1, was the discipline of pure reason. Discipline, he says, has an entirely negative sense. We restrict theoretical reason to mathematical physics. Okay, now, just further down in this paragraph, he's beginning to point to where we're going.
What page is that?
So it's B823, which is the very beginning of second chapter of the Transcendental Doctrine of Method. In the Cambridge edition, we're on page 672. So in the first paragraph, and I'm reading just the last sentence of the first paragraph, a typical brief aphorism: the greatest and perhaps only utility of all philosophy of pure reason is thus only negative, namely that it does not serve for expansion as an organon. So I think we discussed that, organon is just the Greek word for instrument. It enters the Latin tradition through interpretations of Aristotle, where it was misunderstood that Aristotle thought his works on categories, interpretation, and analytics, and sophistic dialectics, those works were all put together and called the organon, as if they were the instrument for the discovery of truth, which is not what Aristotle thought at all. But this is what happens in the tradition. Various misinterpretations occur. And so it becomes a term of art in the medieval period, and it's still accepted now that there is such a thing as an organon. And that fits in well with the modern notion that you do not approach your full experience and try to understand it. You first of all devise a method. That is, you must understand the mind as an organon, as an instrument for your discovery of nature. And Kant is just one of the greater reflections of that notion. Okay, so pure reason is thus the utility of pure reason is not only negative, namely that it does not serve for expansion as an organon, but rather as a discipline, a restriction, and a punishment. If you read in the first chapter, where he talks about the discipline of pure reason, and in passages that we will discuss, he keeps talking about reason as itself having an inexorable desire or a propensity. I think at one point he even uses the term lust. And the discipline of pure reason is to tame, direct, and radically restrict that natural propensity, and he says it's a natural propensity of reason to expand past its proper boundaries. Now, this is a continuation of what Descartes is saying when he says that we will conquer nature, but this is the completion of the project by conquering human nature. Okay. Okay. So we're halfway through this sentence. Okay, so the greatest, and I'm going to come back to this phrase, perhaps only, at the end of our discussion. The greatest and perhaps only utility of all philosophy of pure reason is thus only negative, namely that it does not serve for expansion as an organon, but rather as a discipline, serves for the determination of boundaries, and instead of discovering truth, it has only the silent merit of guarding against errors. So you can know nothing more than, say, Newton's Mathematica Principia about the world, reasonably. That's the negative part. The positive is going to immediately follow. Now, if we look in the next paragraph, so we're on, it's B824, which in the Cambridge is page 672. Yeah, just before B824, there's a paragraph that begins, nevertheless. So, nevertheless, there must be somewhere a source of positive cognitions that belong in the domain of pure reason and that perhaps give occasion for errors only through misunderstanding, but that in fact constitute the goal of a strenuous effort of reason. So what he's saying, the whole previous tradition, up till Christian Wolff, including Leibniz, Plato, the whole medieval tradition, all of their various attempts to understand the genuine principles of things are, of course, totally erroneous because they've misused reason. But given that it all is erroneous, but is there a positive source that is something that we can say something intelligible about, that is the source of that error? And yes, the answer is yes. And it's the last sentence of this paragraph. Presumably, it may hope for better luck on the only path that still remains for it, that of its practical use. So reason cannot discover anything in its theoretical use, apart from mathematical physics, but it can in its practical use. Okay, so then if we come now to I'm just going to read a couple of lines from the first section of this, the canon of pure reason, on the ultimate end of the pure use of our reason. This is page 674 of the Cambridge, and it's page B827. in the text. I just have to try and make this intelligible. He's discussing in this last sentence in this paragraph on B827. He says, in a word, these three propositions. Now, the three propositions are that the human being has a free will, that there is a human soul that is immortal, and that there is a God. So he's discussing these three propositions, and he says, in a word, these three propositions always remain transcendent for speculative reason. They are beyond our experience. They have no sensual cognitive, they have no sensual relation to our cognition, so they don't exist, theoretically. We cannot know anything about them. There is no knowledge of these three propositions, which are obviously taught in his time, both from a point of view of theology and natural theology, which is a sort of an attempt to marry philosophy and theology. Okay, so in a word, these three propositions always remain transcendent for speculative reason and have no immanent use, i.e. one that is permissible for objects of experience and therefore useful for us in some way, but are rather considered in themselves entirely idle, even though extremely difficult efforts of our reason. Again, the tradition has made these enormous intellectual efforts to justify various metaphysical paradigms. So Aristotle, there are various first causes, perhaps 66, according to Book Lambda of the Metaphysics, and also in Aquinas. I think I read a couple of lines from the second question of the first part of the Summa Theologica, where he says there are 5 ways in which you can show the existence of God beginning from ordinary experience. And this is all out. All of those metaphysical attempts are out. Right, but we will come to the positive end of this effort. Just one more line, and then we're going to skip ahead to the second section. So, and this is on B828, the second line. Everything is practical that is possible through freedom. So what he means by practical is the ability to make a moral choice. But if the conditions for the exercise of our free choice are empirical, then in that case, reason can have none but a regulative use and can only serve to produce the unity of empirical laws, as, for example, in the doctrine of prudence, the unification of all ends that are given to us by our inclinations into the single end of happiness, and the harmony of the means for attaining that end constitute the entire business of reason, which can therefore provide none but pragmatic laws of free conduct for reaching the ends recommended to us by the senses, and therefore can provide no pure laws that are determined completely a priori. Okay, so that was typical sharp, concise. Okay, so this is what he's saying. Everything is practical that is possible through freedom. That is, morality is possible only through freedom, and that is opposed to anything we can know empirically. Because empirically, all we have is an endless stream of stimulus responses of other animals seeking their satisfaction, and of the human animal who has reason. The only role that reason plays is exactly as Hume and the others say, as an instrument to the passions. We want to be satisfied, and happiness is just a word for the total satisfaction, the total satisfaction of as many desires as possible. It has no principle. It can't be ordered into a system because it's just whatever satisfies us, which is particular and individual and so on. Okay, so with that, we can skip ahead to our section, which is the Canon of Pure Reason, the second section. And this is on page 676 of the Cambridge, and B832 in Kant's text, B832. Sorry, Kirsten, were you going to?
Sorry, is he saying that there's two levels of law, of practical law? One is a priori and one is a posteriori, or
Yes.
practical?
Yeah, so you could form, pragmatic laws.
Yeah.
Now, they're going to be relative to the particular satisfactions and the particular objects of those satisfactions and the particular means. And so they're not going to be pure a priori laws.
But they are all like.
Yes.
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 Yeah. So two different kinds of orders of law.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the pragmatic laws will ultimately depend upon, laws of motion and so on, or because the stimulus response of the human animal is directed naturally to these things. So it's not as if you're displaying your free choice as a human to want. If you want satisfaction, that's just you as a human animal. That's not you as a human specifically being guided by your reason. You're using your reason instrumentally to get to the ends given by your animal self. Your his expression, pathological self. Pathos is the Greek word for experience or suffering. So you are affected by a passion. That passion comes from pathos, right? You're affected by a passion, and then you seek to, satisfy that passion. And they used to talk about stimulus response in psychology for a while. They've probably got something else now: neuron X and neuron Y. But does that help? Okay. So second section. Of the ideal of the highest good. So ideal hasn't been a word of great praise so far in the book, right? So the understanding has concepts that order the physical world. Reason has ideas and ideals that have no relation to reality thus far. I'm simplifying, but that's why he says they only have a regulative use. We use our reason to sort through the immense data we get from the concepts of the understanding, from our experience of the physical world, and we try and order it into a systematic whole. So it regulates our understanding, but it doesn't have any relation to reality. We're now going to get a relation between reason and ideals and reality, in a sense, and that's going to govern the whole rest of the understanding of the book. Now, let's just begin reading and get as far as we can. And so, in its speculative use, so reason speculates, the understanding cognizes, right? Because the sensual correlate to the concepts. So the understanding grasps things. Reason speculates because it doesn't have that same connection to what's given to us. In its speculative use, reason led us through the field of experiences, and since it could never find complete satisfaction for itself there, it led us on from there to speculative ideas. The three main speculative ideas are human freedom, immortal soul, God, right? Which in the end, however, led us back again to experience and thus fulfilled its aim in a way that is quite useful, but not quite in accord with our expectation. Quite useful to find out that reason cannot say that there are those things. So that we can confirm our science, our mathematical physics, but we only confirm that reason does not have a theoretical use. Now yet another experiment remains open to us. So the first experiment is Copernican turn. Are the objects of our science, do they have a certain character that then we have to work out in our reception of them, or do we impart their form? And we find out that thinking itself imparts form to the objects. Now, this experiment is going to be the same thing on the moral level. Yet another experiment remains open to us, namely whether pure reason is also to be found in practical use, whether in that use it leads us to the ideas that attain the highest ends of pure reason per se, right, which we have just adduced, and thus whether from the point of view of its practical interest, reason may not be able to guarantee that which in regard to its speculative interest it entirely refuses to us. So as theoretical, reason cannot actually, he says, it can't even give us a hint that there are such things as human freedom, that there are such things as an immortal soul and a God. It cannot say a word theoretically in favour of that. But if we orientate ourselves by our moral experience, it may, he says, guarantee it as a presupposition of our moral experience. That's what he's going to argue in this section. So he then says, all interest of my reason, the speculative as well as the practical, is united in the following three questions. So these three questions are meant to comprehend our theoretical and practical interests. One, what can I know? Typical modern thinking, you start with epistemology or a method, or you critique the mind, and then you look at the world. Okay. So what can I know? What should I hope? Sorry, what should I do, and what may I hope? Now, yeah, we'll go on. I will have to get more selective shortly because otherwise we'll run out of room. But let me just see. Okay. So the first question is merely speculative. We have, as I flatter myself, already exhausted all possible replies to it, and finally found that with which reason must certainly satisfy itself, and with which, if it does not look to the practical, it also has cause to be content. That is, only physics. But from the two great ends to which this entire effort of pure reason was really directed, we remain just as distant as if, out of a concern for comfort, we had declined this labour at the outset. Now, I'll just read the last sentence. If therefore the issue is knowledge, then this much at least is certain and settled, that we can never partake of knowledge with respect to those two problems. Now, what are the two great ends to which this entire effort of pure reason was really directed? Is that the next two questions? What should I do, and what may I hope? So I'm assuming that that's what he means. That our question about what can I know is not in the slightest degree addressed by the questions. That allows reason no way of addressing the other two questions initially on the theoretical level. The second question is merely practical or moral for Kant. As such, to be sure, it can belong to pure reason, but in that case it is not transcendental but moral. And thus it cannot be in itself a subject of our critique. It's not transcendental because he's not saying that there is a particular being beyond our sense experience. He is saying there is a particular ought. So there's no object. There's a moral command that is not in itself a thing. The third question, namely, if I do what I should, what may I then hope, is simultaneously practical and theoretical. So the first question is theoretical, the second is practical, and the third combines the two. If I do what I ought to do, what may I hope? And that depends upon understanding something. So that the practical leads like a clue to the reply to the theoretical question, and in its highest form, the speculative question. That is, whether or not there is like a highest being who orders the world and so on. Okay. I want to go to the last paragraph on this page, which in the Cambridge is 677, and it's B834, second paragraph. So happiness is the satisfaction of all of our inclinations. And I'm going to ignore the distinctions between extensive, intensive, and protensive. The practical law from the motive of happiness I call pragmatic. So we had that distinction before. There are pragmatic laws that govern our ability to satisfy our desires. Or he calls that the rule of prudence. Now this is a demotion. So in Aristotle and in Plato, the word prudence, well, what was translated into Latin as prudentia, it's a translation of a Greek word phronesis, which means thoughtfulness. And it has two aspects. One is Aristotle actually uses it as his word for practical intelligence. If you know what you should do, be just, liberal, courageous, then prudence is that ability to show you the means to that end. And that's how Kant is using it. But both Plato and Aristotle use phronesis when they talk about the highest reaches of their metaphysics, because there are aspects of judgment about what's better or worse that are inescapable there. And this is what Kant wants to exclude. Okay. The practical law from the motive of happiness I call pragmatic. The rule of prudence, the ability to judge the means to the ends that will satisfy us. But that which is such that it has no other motive than the worthiness to be happy, I call moral, or moral law. Right. So he's distinguishing happiness, in which he has demoted happiness to satisfaction. Whereas in the first book of Aristotle's Ethics, happiness is the comprehensive end, which includes theory as well as practice. Whereas it's much lower now, because there are no natural ends. Reason is going to conquer nature. So happiness is, pragmatic satisfaction. The worthiness to be happy is the act of being moral. So he's asserting that in our own efforts to be moral, because he's going to talk at length, especially in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, that the first claim of that book is the only unconditioned good is the good will, that is the will to do what's moral. And so therefore, and he opposes that to the desire to be happy, exactly as he's doing here. But within the admiration that we have for the moral, we have a sense that justice would require that the person who acts morally is rewarded. So it's not our selfish desire, he is claiming, it's part of our admiration for morality that we think it would be worthy of being rewarded, even though what we constantly see in life is that it's not. Tyrants die happy in their sleep, and so on and so forth. Look at any election. Yeah. Okay, so the pragmatic rule, advises us what to do if you want to partake of happiness. The second commands how we should behave in order even to be worthy of happiness. The first is grounded on empirical principles, for except by means of experience I can know neither which inclinations there are that will be satisfied, nor what the natural causes are that would satisfy them. The second abstracts from inclinations and natural means of satisfying them and considers only the freedom of a rational being in general and the necessary conditions under which alone it is in agreement with the distribution of happiness in accordance with principles. And thus it, at least, can rest on mere ideas of pure reason and be cognized a priori. I'm going to simplify that, and whenever I do these simplifications, I'm naturally going to get some things in wrong, but just to communicate, the main point is that we recognize when someone acts morally, we recognize they are overcoming an inclination that would satisfy them. So they are not acting according to natural causes. Right? So a typical example from philosophy seminars, if someone jumps into a river to save a child drowning, right, they are disregarding the natural satisfaction of themselves not being at risk of dying in order to do something that is moral, to save someone who's in trouble. So that means they are acting against nature, beyond natural causation. That's the claim. And that means, given that this understanding, happiness is to do with empirical satisfaction, given that, they must be acting in accord with an idea that is pure and a priori. It's not derived from any satisfaction they could get empirically. Now, at this point, he says, so this is the beginning of B835. At this point, he says, I assume that there really are pure moral laws which determine completely a priori, without regard to empirical motives. So someone does the self-sacrificing thing for someone else. There's no empirical motive for happiness. Now, from the point of Aristotle, that would be insane, because you wouldn't be able to live with yourself if you let the child die, and so on and so forth. And it's part of happiness to do things that are noble, and that may cost you your life. But that's because life is inherently tragic. One question that the modern philosophers have a great difficulty dealing with is tragedy, because the Enlightenment is supposed to eliminate tragedy, and that's why people who take themselves to be opposed to it, but are really aspects of it, like Nietzsche, try to bring tragedy back in. You're not facing the horrible truths of life and so on. Okay, so, but here he's saying, I assume there are really pure moral laws that determine the will completely a priori, because there's no obvious satisfaction the person can get from this, and they're doing it purely out of a moral motive. We do need to read the end of this paragraph. Okay, so the moral laws determine completely a priori the action and omission, i.e. the use of the freedom of a rational being in general, and we're still assuming, and that these laws command absolutely, not merely hypothetically, under the presupposition of other empirical ends. That is, the person doesn't jump into the river to save the child because they get a reward. That's the assumption. It commands absolutely, you must do that, no question. And are thus necessary in every respect. So he's using these words very deliberately. So remember when we began the transcendental aesthetic, he said, we cannot get anything A, universal, and B, necessary from empirical experience. So there must be a priori cognition. So if there's something like causation that is both necessary and universal, that must be an a priori cognition. So same here, he's saying in the moral field, we have moral demands that are absolute and therefore necessary, and they're universal. So that means they must be a priori principles. That's the argument. Okay, so last sentence of this paragraph in the first paragraph of B835. I can legitimately presuppose this proposition by appealing not only to the proofs of the most enlightened moralist, but also to the moral judgment of every human being, if he will distinctly think such a law. Now, I just want to provide some more evidence for this paragraph on the handout that I distributed before and that I'm now putting up online. And it's just a couple of lines from an essay. Do I have? Yes. Called On the Common Saying That May Be True in Theory, but it doesn't hold in practice. Right? So if you're looking at this handout, it's the second main paragraph that begins with the concept of duty. And this, if you have time at some point, this essay on the common saying that may hold in theory but not in practice gives you a helpful overview of the implications of Kant's thought, because he's dealing with three different critics on the theoretical, ethical, and political level. And so you get comments, general comments by him on those levels, and it's quite helpful. Okay, so I'll read this quote. The concept of duty in its complete purity is not only incomparably simpler, clearer, and, for practical use, more readily grasped and more natural to everyone than any motive derived from happiness or mixed with it and with regard to it, with regard for happiness, which always requires much art and reflection. So the concept of duty, that is, that there is a moral command upon us, is clearer than our empirical desire for satisfaction, and everyone must admit this. This is what he wants to claim. It is also, even in the judgment of the most common human reason, if only the concept is presented in its purity to a human will, separated from and even in opposition to the latter, far more powerful, forceful, and promising of results than all the motives borrowed from the latter selfish principle. So the moral motive is far more powerful and far more clear to every human being than our empirical motives. Now, you've got to remember, of course, he was brought up in Prussia. Standards of moral behaviour may be quite different. Now, I put in brackets there, take any example of a conflict between duty and happiness, because he provides an example, and then he says, quote, even a child some 8 or 9 years old will be able to say only this, it is wrong. That is, it conflicts with duty. These distinctions are inscribed on the human soul in the broadest and most legible characters. Now, this is very interesting and helpful for understanding all of his philosophy. There's a famous passage in the second critique, the critique of practical reason, where he says that morality is, quote, a fact of reason. Right? So we've gone through all of this. Reason has only ideas and ideals. It cannot give you facts. The fact of human existence is that we have a moral demand upon us. Okay. Now, yeah, if we go to the end of the next, so the next paragraph, actually, I'll read the first sentence of the next paragraph. So still on B835. Pure reason thus contains, not in its speculative, that's reason in its theoretical aspect, not in its speculative use to be sure, but yet in a certain practical use, namely the moral use, principles of the possibility of experience, namely of those actions in conformity with moral principles which could be encountered in the history of humankind. Okay, so the principles we found in the transcendental aesthetic were, what are the principles that allow for the possibility of our sensual experience, or space and time? Right. Now, he's looking at our moral experience. What are the principles that allow for the possibility of the fact that we have this moral demand upon us? Well, there must be a priori moral principles. Just as there must be a priori principles of sensibility. Okay. Now, end of this paragraph, which is at the very beginning of B836. Thus, the principles of pure reason have objective reality in their practical use, that is, in their moral use. That's like using the phrase fact of reason in the critique of practical reason. We actually, so in our world, there is mathematical physics, which is transcendentally ideal and empirically real. But we have a genuine access to reality through our sense of a moral demand. Okay. Yeah, the next paragraph is really kind of crazy, and I think we need to read that. So we're in B836. Actually, I emailed a couple of pages that we absolutely had to read, and I don't have that before me. Can you see that on the? I know, because if I just want to make sure I don't miss these.
B,
B.
is it B 840 to 842?
840 to 3, just that? I thought there was 2, but
B 832 to 834, is that right?
832 to 834.
Just
Okay, so we've done that. And we'll get to B 840 shortly. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, so we're at the beginning of B 836, second paragraph. I call the world as it would be if it were in conformity with all moral laws, as it can be in accordance with the freedom of rational beings, and should be in accordance with the necessary laws of morality, a moral world. Okay, so this is an idea, it's not a reality. The moral world is the world as it would be if everyone acted morally. Okay. But if that should be the case, that means it can be the case if there are free rational beings who act in accordance with morality. Okay. This is conceived thus far merely as an intelligible world. It's systematic, intelligible, but it's a construction. Okay? Since abstraction is made therein from all conditions, ends, and even from all hindrances to morality in it, the weakness or impurity of human nature. So yeah, if we the moral world in which everyone does what they should doesn't include particular ends, for example, diving into rivers to save children, or and also it abstracts from the human desire for satisfaction that gets in the way of people acting morally. Okay. Thus far, it is therefore a mere yet practical idea, which really can and should have its influence on the sensible world in order to make it agree as far as possible with this idea. So it's an idea, that is, it's a construction of reason, okay, which should have an effect, but may or may not, because we're rubbish, we humans. The idea of a moral world thus has objective reality, not as if it pertained to an object of an intelligible intuition. So we are not, unlike, say, in Plato or Aristotle, able to perceive what is just by nature if we happen to be brilliant. So there is no intellectual intuition. It's an object of reason, a construction of reason. For we cannot even think of such a thing, so he thinks. But as pertaining to the sensible world, although as an object of pure... Did I skip a line in order to make... Yeah. The idea of a moral world thus has objective reality, not as if it pertained to an object of intelligible intuition, which he doesn't think exists, for we cannot even think such a thing. So it has objective reality, but as pertaining to the sensible world, although as an object of pure reason in its practical use and a corpus mysticum of the rational beings in it, insofar as their free choice under moral laws has thoroughgoing systematic unity in itself as well as with the freedom of everyone else. Yeah, thanks for settling that problem. I thought I was confused, but...
What paragraph was that?
So that's on B836. Now, if I have any... I don't know if this is correct, but corpus mysticum, I believe that comes from the Catholic tradition as like the body of peace. Is that when you're eating the wafers and that's the body of Christ and that's the mysterious body? Or because that just means corpus mysticum just means Latin mystical body, mysterious body, unknown, unknowable. Now he's transferring. Sorry.
So are we dealing? Are we at the same register as things like the transcendental object?
Yes, but yeah. So we want to deny there are transcendental objects.
Now, or
yeah.
So this is a move away, but I think he'd proven them previously.
Well, so we've proven, in accepting Kant, we've proven there are no transcendent beings such as God, soul, freedom, which transcend our empirical experience. But now he's trying to claim there is objective reality to our moral experience guarantees that there's an objective reality to the moral law, and
maybe instead of transcendental object, I should be saying the object equal to X. This concept that we've previously encountered of a transcendental object, that nonetheless...
Which, theoretically we can't show at all in the slightest, but which, as a result of our practical experience, we can say that we suppose it.
Positive.
Yes.
It has to be, in fact.
It has to be. He's going to say that you have to posit it, but that's still not theoretical knowledge. Yeah. It's an aspect of it's an implication of your moral experience. And we will come back to this shortly, because the priority that he gives to freedom over the other two is decisive on this question of what we think of their being. So I'll read the phrase one more time. Although as an object of pure reason in its practical use, and a corpus mysticum of the rational beings is in it. So that's the moral world, the rational beings in the moral world. Again, we have to accept the mystery. Did you? Okay.
Okay, I've got a lot, but yeah.
I'm just going to keep reading, so if you want to jump in and...
Okay, I mean, the way I make sense of this is, and this is, I'm having a little bit of trouble reconciling this with the passage that you gave us about duty, because all he's saying in this entire argument, is that that if there is a moral law, like the moral law is the exact way that we have to be if we want to earn our happiness. We have to behave this way to be able to...
That's an interesting interpretation, but he is saying that what we recognise as moral is acting in a manner worthy of happiness, but he's not saying we calculate, if I genuinely want to be happy, I should be moral. He's absolutely opposed to that. Yeah?
It's, I don't know, it's not a calculation, but it's still, I mean, it is about doing something that is worthy of being happy.
Yeah, so the person who dies in the river, right?
Yeah.
Is worthy of happy. They're going to lose their happiness because they throw their life away to save this child, push the child forward, and then get eaten by alligators.
Yes, they're no longer happy. Can't be happy.
Yeah, so they're not going to be happy. But if you look at it, he's saying, if you look at this objectively, that the person is worthy of happiness. This person who put the PFAS chemicals into everything that's going to slowly kill us all, that person is not worthy of happiness, but they have 3 mansions on the coast. So this is what happens in our ordinary experience. But our judgment is, he is saying that anyone 8-year-old and above, raised in Prussia properly, would recognise immediately that this person is worthy of happiness, even though their life is now extinct.
But so the moral law is the law that says that person who has earned it is worthy of happiness. That's all the moral law is, and he wants to say that has objective reality.
Yes.
But the only way he can get to the moral law is by, the traditional way to get there is by saying that there is an afterlife and you'll be judged and there'll be a judgment.
We'll get to that.
But he won't obviously say that, but he does have something like it in this argument.
Well, let's wait till we get to there, because he's going to say much more precisely than I can summarise the relation between those thoughts and morality. We will definitely, in fact, where are we? We're on B837. Yeah, I just want to read a couple of lines here and then we'll skip ahead. So at B836 at the very end, just before B837, there's a paragraph where he says, this was the reply to the first of the two questions of pure reason that concern the practical interest. What ought I to do? Right? Second question. First question, what can I know? Second question, what do I do that through which you will become worthy to be happy, not necessarily happy. In fact, if you aim at happiness, he's very suspicious about happiness and pleasure. If you read the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, pages after page about how if you aim at happiness, you're just a plebeian. No, he wouldn't use that because he's actually in favour of the plebs. You're wrong. Okay. Now the second question asks, now if I behave so as not to be unworthy of happiness, how may I hope thereby to partake of happiness, given that so-and-so is dying in the river and the other person who's put the PFAS into everything has 5 mansions. Now, if we skip over the page to 839, B839, actually, no, I need B838, just the paragraph before B839. He says, I call the idea of such an intelligence in which the morally, so God, basically an idea of a God who's a perfect being, perfectly intelligent, who gives happiness in proportion to worth. So that's an idea. We can know nothing about that. He's tried to disprove there is any possibility of showing that there is such a thing as a God in the main part of the work, right? That's out, right? I call the idea of such an intelligence in which the morally most perfect will, combined with the highest blessedness, is the cause of all happiness in the world insofar as it stands in exact relation with morality. That is, I call that the ideal of the highest good. So we're replacing the traditional notion of a God with an ideal of the highest good. Now, thus, only in the ideal of the highest original good can pure reason find the ground of the practically necessary connection of both elements of the highest derived good, namely of an intelligible moral world. Thus, only in the ideal of there being some kind of godlike intelligence governing the world can pure reason find the ground of the practically necessary connection between morality and happiness. So I'm going to destroy the fineness of the reasoning and just say only in the idea of a God can there be realized the intuitive link between morality and happiness that we perceive in recognizing moral demands, that we recognize that that person deserves to be happy.
Yeah.
Right, which is, I know you were saying that, and we're going to come back right to this point. I just want to get to what he says, and then you can hack it to pieces with your machete. Yeah, actually, they've been banned in this state, which is going to solve all the problems. Yeah. Okay, so we have to go on to the end of this paragraph. Now, since we must necessarily represent ourselves through reason as belonging to such a world, since we have an experience of morality, we must represent ourselves as if we belong to a moral world, not this world. While we live in this world, we should act morally. That's what that means. Right? Although the senses do not present us with anything except a world of appearances, we must assume the moral world, which he has discussed before, right, to be a consequence of our conduct in the sensible world. Because we see people act against their inclinations. Therefore, we recognize that there is morality, and in ourselves as well. And since the latter, conduct in the sensible world, does not offer such a connection to us, we must assume the former to be a world that is future for us. Thus, God and a future life are two presuppositions. Presuppositions. They're not thoughts, they're not knowledge, they cannot be an object of knowledge. They're presuppositions that are not to be separated from the obligation that pure reason imposes on us in accordance with the principles of that very same reason. Now, what is vital here is to recognize the priority of morality and freedom. God, future life, these things are totally subordinate to that. Now, if you look at this from the 21st, we're very sophisticated now. No one has any belief in anything, right? It looks like he is hearkening back to a world, a religious world that we are no longer a part of. And he is rhetorically, but what he is doing is also extremely radical, because he's saying that all of the theological teachings of my time are wrong. Because they say, I reveal to you that there is a God who has certain commands. No, that's all wrong. The priority is you recognize a moral demand and you must presuppose something like that, but that depends upon your moral experience. And that's a presupposition. And it's a systematic idea. All this stuff you have about your particular story and narrative and so on, that's all fiction. That is very radical for, not just for the time, but in per se. Now,
but is it right to say, like, all of that is for, like, all the subordination and the structure of that argument, all of it is for an idea of a moral law, which is law-like. So it's just the guarantee that there is a way in the world for you to behave and you will be happy. By law.
It's a presupposition. I'm not sure I follow your suggestion.
Are you saying, and my understanding is very rudimentary, that the old idea was that God existed and therefore you had to be moral.
Yeah.
And now you're saying you have to be moral. You do have to be moral.
Yes.
Therefore there's a God.
Yes, as a presupposition, not something we could ever prove. And so what he wants to do is to eliminate the possibility of saying we begin with our ordinary experience and we ascend to principles of justice or principles of courage, and that's from the classical philosophy point of view, to first principles of nature. And from the theological point of view, you cannot ascend to your ordinary experience to the notion that there is a God. Like the example in Aquinas, everything is in a state of potentiality, which requires something that's in a state of actuality or something. There's I'm trying to use the simplest one, but it would just take a long time to develop them all. But so we can't ascend from our experience to those principles, except one area. You can recognize a moral act, and that requires us to recognize that there is a non-empirical, non-varying, necessary demand and therefore a moral law. And that requires us to presuppose, because it's implicit in the notion of acting morally and therefore for the sake of being worthy of happiness, not for the sake of your own satisfaction. It's implicit that would be worked out. Yes. Yeah, so I'm just summarising what you're saying. That, they're actually, I think there's something, a statement that comes very close to your statement, Jeremy. I'm just going to find it. But it's very important because it does show what he's saying here. And I'll go to it, then we'll have a break. I'll just one more sentence, which is on page B847, so 684 of the Cambridge, B847. And 2 lines under B847. I hope we can make sense of this in the middle of this passage. So far as practical reason has the right to lead us, we will not hold actions to be obligatory because they are God's commands, exactly as you say, but will rather regard them as divine commands because we are internally obligated to them. So that's essentially what you were saying, yes?
It feels like that.
Yes. So this is this is the completion of the modern project to put the human subject without any natural demands at the centre of the cosmos and make the cosmos around it. Now, this is a very simple summary, but we reason out into universal necessary laws the implications of our moral experience, and that gives us a standard by which to say that whether or not there's a God or what a God would be. So Kant can now say, you, Church X, teaching that God has these and those empirical characteristics, appears in a desert to someone, or that's obviously all fiction, right? Because you're abstracting from the essence of what a God is, which is as a pure intelligence that distributes happiness in accordance with merit. Everything else is myth. You know, in the dialogue, The Euthyphro by Plato, Socrates is talking to a kind of mad theologian who is about to prosecute his father for murder, which at the time was considered eccentric. And in this conversation, Socrates poses the following question. So, is what is just because the gods love it? Or is it loved by the gods because it's just? That is to say, is there a prior principle of justice which, if the gods recognize justice, they do so because they recognize the same principle that we recognize? Or do they make that, and whatever they make is what we have to follow? Now that question that poses a real dilemma for any theology, and so theologians have approached it in several ways, but there are two main ways to approach it. One is to say, well, anything is just or good in any sense because it was made by our God, and everything follows from that, and therefore reason is secondary. Okay? The other way is to say we have a rational God of whom these principles are an aspect, or of whom they are the creation, and therefore you can reason from your ordinary experience to our God. Those are the two different responses. Now, but what Kant is saying is decisively reason has the priority. So any belief that anyone has is radically derivative from the truth. As he says, like here, you will regard the obligations of practical reason as divine commands because we are internally obligated to them. And so the notion that there are God is a secondary presupposition to that. Okay, we've gone on very long. We should have a break, and we'll summarise. Okay. So we have 40 minutes. I was going to make a few suggestions, but I'd be very happy to have any other suggestions made now, or during, or after. If anyone wants to bring anything up. We've seen a few paragraphs from a 900-page book, so we haven't conquered it, but I hope we've just seen something of the change of perspective that Kant wants to make on both the theoretical and practical level. I'll make a couple of suggestions, but please.
Alan's got a...
Oh, yeah, Alan. Yes, Alan?
Oh, yes. Martin, I'd sent a note to you, and it's sort of, I suppose, not quite about what you're talking about, but why did Kant decide to use the term transcendental?
That's right. I meant to reply.
That question really helps me too.
Fascinating word. The word just means to pass over. To pass across something. It literally means to climb over something.
Scandality is climb, to climb.
Exactly, climb over. It was the medievals picked up on the use and called transcendent certain things that were not covered in Aristotle's category. So Aristotle says every being that has the following 10 aspects. It's a substance, like it's a being distinguishable from other beings. It has a place. It has change of motion, blah, blah, blah. 10 categories. It has attributes. Now, the medievals argued, well, there are 3 or 4, depends on which author, categories, not categories, but attributes that are transcendent and that include every possible conceivable thing not included in the categories. They transcend the categories that describe particular kinds of things. And they are unity, which is already included in substance, so wrong, okay? Being, that's already included in the first category too, out. Good, that's already included in the second category of quality, out. But this is the way they thought of it, right? If everything being is created being, then it's more or less good as endowed by its creator. And it has a unity endowed by the only unified being that's fully unified and fully actual, which is God, and so on. So they thought there were these aspects of things that transcend any particular kind of thing. So Kant picks up on that to say there are no transcendent beings. There's no immortal soul discoverable by reason. There's no God discoverable by reason through reasoning about our ordinary experience. What there are is transcendental cognitions. There is an aspect of our thought that transcends any particular thought, and his phrase for this is, I am going to show you the, quote, conditions for the possibility of two things: mathematical physics and logic on the one hand, moral experience on the other. What are the conditions for the possibility of those two things? On the one hand, that there are a priori sensible forms, time and space, and a priori concepts of the understanding that, when aroused by sensible intuition, form concepts of concrete objects. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have moral experience, everyone 8 and above, at least in Königsberg, does, from which we can derive necessary laws such as that we can presuppose that you are worthy of happiness, and therefore we can presuppose the ideal of a moral world, and therefore the idea of a God and an afterlife. Alan, is that...
Yes, thank you. I mean, the actual word itself, did he decide to use that word because it had been used by the medievals?
Yes, and he uses a lot of medieval terminology. Like, you know how if you look at the Critique of Pure Reason, there's a lot of Latin, and in many cases he is using a medieval term in a different sense, and in some cases he just, because of course as an educated person in 18th century Germany, Latin, so he just translates his new term into a Latin phrase, but many of them are reconfigurations of terms in that tradition. And so here's Bacon in the New Organon, when he's trying to revolutionize modern science, says, as Machiavelli wisely said, like 3 references in 25 volumes to Machiavelli, who he clearly read, it's best to pour new wine into old bottles. And Bacon does this because when he gets to his fundamental notion of nature, he says a natural law of the behavior of the material underpinnings of things, but he says, and I call this form. Why? Because form is a completely respectable Aristotelian word. New wine, old bottle. Right? And so Kant, and I'm not saying he has a cunning plan, because cunningness is immoral for Kant, and he would look down on it. But he does assimilate the traditional teaching to his own through its terminology sometimes.
Well, thank you for that, because I've asked many people to answer that question, and you're the first one that's come up with a reasonable answer. And I'm talking about professional philosophers, and there always seems to be, they dodge the question, let's say. But you've answered it. Thank you very much.
May not be right, but yeah. And I embrace my rank as an amateur, because that means I love the field rather than that I get paid by the hour. In accord with the moral law, of course. Now, yeah, but were there any other? Did you want to say, Cameron? Sorry? Oh, Sam. Sorry, I can't see all the.
Hello. Quick question. Does Kant say anything about how we acquire or come into the concepts of the understanding?
how we acquire them as we have, how do we get that rational capability, or how do we come to the conclusion that there definitely are a priori cognitions?
The concepts that organize the sense data,
Yeah.
I can't assume you're born into it or it's arrives there. So how do you have them? Or is it something that you have to come into experience? I find that would be strange every time you're born into the world. You have to go through experience to have this apparatus.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, and I am not aware of a specific answer. He's definitely trying to say we have to assume there are such a priori cognitions simply on the basis of the fact that we have, mathematics and physics. So it's an argument back from what we do have. And I can't remember him saying how it is that every child grows into it. And he's
The reason I ask it, because a couple of lessons before we were talking about how there can be some cultural contingency on these concepts. I was talking about Africa, and then you were saying in his early writings he eliminates that and says that would be diluted if you saw a dog and you didn't it didn't go through the concept. But in my mind, these are things that are acquired from the world around you, so they are contingent. So for him to say that is odd in my eyes.
Yeah, so...
Will we get passage there?
Yeah, please. Sorry, Cameron has a...
Well, just in the introduction, this question is reminding me of a passage in the introduction near B2 where he's saying, although all our cognition commences with experience, yet it does not on that account all arise from experience. For it could well be that even our experiential cognition is a composite of that which we receive through impressions and that which our own cognitive faculty, merely prompted by sensible impressions, provides out of itself, which addition we can't distinguish from that fundamental material until long practice has made us attentive to it and skilled in separating it out.
Yes, no, that's very good. But that helps us thus far, that he's saying you have to admit that we have certain experiences of knowledge that require that there be these a priori principles, and it takes long meditation to figure out what those principles are, and 400 pages in the middle of the book to explain how we derive them from the character of our judgments into a priori concepts. And that's one thing. Then how do we explain that that someone every child has to grow into them? Because we're excluded from the possibility of saying that, as Aristotle just says, that natural beings come in various kinds: those with only nutrition, those with nutrition and passion, those with nutrition, passion, and intellect. And so when you're a human being and you grow to a certain age, you will realize a capacity that's inherent in you from the beginning, which you may not realize because of accident or deprivation or something, but you can realize. It means that there's this very stark contrast between rational beings, human beings, and everything else. Like Descartes, who suggests that all the other animals are just like robots. Now, so I still don't know how we explain Samson's question about how you grow into that capacity, but I don't know.
No, that's all right.
Sorry, Sam?
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, that's fine. Thanks.
Yeah.
Wouldn't Kant just say that he doesn't need to explain it because because we're just talking about the experience that we already have and how that comes about. So if you're having an experience, then you can have an understanding of the a priori conditions, and you can have Kant, and it all comes together in one instance.
He is saying we cannot deny that we have experiences that require there be a priori principles of nature and of morals.
Yeah, I'm not saying that that's adequate. I think
Yeah.
Sam's question's an excellent one. Yeah.
Well, actually, this reminds me, there are 2 points in this book. One where he says all of our inclinations to be happy and desire satisfaction and our reasoned ability to calculate what they are, that may be itself due to nature in another sense. Now, and that would be against his teaching that nature is just causal, right? That there is this, and then in the preface, it's almost a joke where he says, he's talking about how we came to have all these delusions of metaphysics, and he says, if I talk of nature in the sense of what does happen, then this is what's happened. But if I talk about it in what should happen, then this should have happened. But what should happen by nature, that's like an Aristotelian teleological concept, that there are natural beings with ends like reason. And what happens in the critique of judgment a few years later is that he says we have to posit teleological ends in nature as a heuristic device, that is, and he's right, to some degree, because you cannot understand animals as acting according to mechanical laws. It doesn't, they heal the way we heal, right? That's not a mechanic. There's no mechanical law that stitches together a cut, right? But biology, because biology would like to be as rigorous as physics, but it can't be, because these living beings act in a way that's too complicated for a reductive mechanical science. It's just a fact. And Kant recognises that fact by saying, well, as a heuristic, that is as a regulating principle that allows us to discover things, we have to assume that in animals.
However, I'm not sure that his transcendental philosophy is aimed necessarily at a public audience. That it's not. I don't think. I'm not sure whether. I suppose in theory, anyone who thinks may be able to reach the conclusions that Kant reaches in respect of his transcendental philosophy. But he does talk about the difference between schools of thought and the public conviction about these core concepts that he's dealing with. What is it? God, freedom, and the soul. Which I think he's sort of distinguishing it. I'm not sure that he's saying everyone is capable.
Well, he says at the end of the B preface, he says, at the end of the A preface, he says, I've finished critical philosophy, that's it. There's no further philosophy. Mine is the true philosophy. And in the B preface, he extrapolates on that and says, you, as someone who finds it persuasive, can help popularise it, because what I've done here can't be popularised, but the end can be. The end that any 8-year-old can recognise that there is a moral law. And I wish I could find this passage, I was looking for it, where he says there's no difference in the concept between anyone, the 8-year-old, and him. There's a difference in the conceptual apparatus around it, but the concept's the same. And that allows him to make his argument for the equality of the dignity of all human beings, because there is a choice that we make, a moral one, in his view, and anyone can be posed that question. Whereas for Plato and Aristotle, most people don't know the right questions, and most people are better off with myth. I'm just being very simplistic, just to draw the contrast. But you could propagate the end of his philosophy universally, and that's what he wants to claim. Okay, I'll make a couple more suggestions, and please react with fury or questions or. Okay, so the ability to argue for a universal end is the same thing as enlightenment. If all human beings have the same end, right? which no one had thought philosophically prior to the early moderns. And to do so on the basis of pure reason without recourse to a natural principle. Okay, I'll make two quick suggestions and then try to explain them. One, that's equivalent to the acceptance of the modern substitution of the mind for the classical on the one hand and the medieval on the other notion of the soul or psyche. We discussed that on the first day. Second, it's equivalent to the elimination of the priority of judgment or discrimination, phronesis, I discussed this before, in both the theoretical and practical domains, in favour of a systematic science. So reason can only be, as he says, systematic or discursive. There's no intellectual intuition, as Aristotle and Plato claim, and there's no priority of individual practical judgment in morality. Otherwise, it couldn't be universal. If there's an enormous difference between me and Churchill for practical judgment, then there's no universal laws of morality. Second, it eliminates the priority of being over becoming. And this has had lots of significance for later thought. First, if all thought is discursive, then what has priority is the fully intelligible principles of judgment, fully intelligible moral laws. Whereas that doesn't make any sense from the classical point of view. All discourse is a reflection of what you're discoursing about. If there's nothing that you're discoursing about, then it's not talk, it's gibberish. It's just fiction. And also the related priority of potentiality over actuality. So to search for the conditions for the possibility of something is to substitute power for being, power for actuality, potential for actuality. Now this is now Kant is doing this. His whole structure of thought is in aid of morality. But the immediate next suggestion that follows, the third step, which is Nietzsche, from Kant, is to say, you, Kant, have just said that human reason, comprehending both understanding and reason, human reason constructs the world and its significance. Why does it have to construct it in this way? And you yourself, Kant, what's the title of the last chapter of your enormous book? The last chapter, which consists of 2.5 pages, is called The History of Pure Reason. So reason can have a history. If reason can have a history, then we have no need to agree that your particular historical articulation of reason is the eternally true one. And so Nietzsche concludes from that people like Kant and Hegel, he says, these are philosophical scholars. The genuine philosophers are the ones who say, thus it shall be. This is how, and they legislate for entire peoples. So if by nature there are no principles and morality, which gives significance to everything, science included, depends upon what Nietzsche calls values that are constructed, then there is no being at all. There's only becoming, which is ordered by people who have the appropriate will into a temporary articulation. And they say, thus it shall be. That is, but it won't be, and Nietzsche knows this very well, he's playing on this. It will only become for a certain period of time before it too passes away like all history. So Nietzsche is doing two things. One, he's saying, you have left us in a state where there is nothing, there's only becoming. But human beings long for what is, or what is always. And that longing cannot be satisfied, but you can have a temporary illusion. And that's the rhetorical difficulty that Nietzsche finds himself in. He is arguing against a certain kind of illusion, which is, to put it bluntly, human equality, because he thinks it leads to a disastrous and ignoble culture. He's arguing in favour of a noble culture, a different kind of illusion, That's his rhetorical difficulty, because he can't give any more truth in being to his solution to the problem that he diagnoses.
Martin, can I ask a question there?
Please.
Martin? Yeah. So it partly relates to what you just said, but also to what you said maybe 4 minutes ago about Kant not having an aspect of universality in his morality. See, I thought that by having the imperative that our actions should reflect the principle that we ought to do what others, we would have others do to us,
Yes.
even though like often that so as a broadly stated principle, that it makes sense. It makes sense. We can understand those words as enunciating a principle, even though in practice there'll be all sorts of disagreements about it. I think it would be reasonable to say that in the average stable political community, the laws are they're basically meant to sort of reflect that, and quite often I'd say they do. So isn't it consistent then with it having an individual and a universal aspect?
So
Because it's sort of a very sophisticated panning out of Christ's injunction. Do to others as you would have them do to you, and he sort of, really pans it out, and of course has no need for God ultimately.
right. So it wouldn't therefore be consistent with, say, yeah, a Catholic teaching, right?
It would be consistent with a Catholic teaching in its practice, but of course not in not
Don't say in theory.
not in theology, of course.
Yeah, no, because it would say that all of what you think as a Catholic is false. The principle is true, and what you've come to believe in reflects some of that truth, and some of it has other things that are wrong, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
But what you're saying is, I think, very kind to the human race, because especially if you look at it from the point of view of 1870, most regimes did give fundamental difference in dignity to different people. Yes, there were rank orders in society, not just in theory, but in practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Okay.
Yeah, and there's no like the equality before the law was not the norm, right?
I think in English law, this is one of the basic
No,
principles.
there is definitely. I was actually going to make an exception for England, but I didn't want to let my Anglophilia be too quickly exposed. Leave aside England.
Well, I mean, just on that point, one of the incredible things, one of the good things of the last 300 years is that just about every country on earth has adopted the institutions that were created by the French and the English, 300 years ago.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, except that I gave them up for a very unfortunate notion of human rights. But that will lead us down another path.
I mean, if that's true, like there is a rank ordering, that just means that there are closer and further away versions of that moral principle.
From Kant's point of view,
Yeah.
From Kant's point of view, there's everyone has equal inherent dignity because they can make a moral choice, and that means, for example, this is why he's in favour of capital punishment. Because if you do something worthy of capital punishment, we respect your human dignity by putting you to death. I guess, that's
the case. And some defendants even now they say that they say, look, if I did this to the dead people, I deserve to die because I can see the suffering of the parents of the kid who I killed, so I deserve to die.
Yeah, but that's bringing in empirical data. But yes, yes.
Yeah,
But that's what Kant is. That's what Kant is saying. That dignity
yeah,
depends upon your ability to choose. But because partly because of Kant's elimination of the notion that there are ends in nature, despite the fact, as I said, reintroduces a heuristic principle in the critique of judgment. But the elimination of ends in nature, which just gives philosophical fulfillment to what Descartes was saying, right? That means that the only end we have is this one moral end, but that's not a positive end, right? It's a restriction on your behaviour.
Sorry, just what actually are you talking about? The one more.
Kant saying act always as if the maximum of your action become a natural law. So if you do something that interferes with that would be a self-contradiction, like you allow lying or you allow cheating. So don't lie, don't cheat, don't. But it doesn't tell you what you should do to fulfill yourself. Yeah.
I just think you should probably wind back a little bit and explain what the golden rule is, because I don't know if everybody.
Golden rule.
What
The
you
do
just
unto
said.
others.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
both Kant and Mill make rhetorical use of the do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They both make rhetorical use of this in order to show the priority of their thought to all religions. Right? They say that they can answer the question that Socrates poses by saying, no, there is something good in itself. And if you have a particular religious belief, it's more or less a bad reflection of that. Right? They both want to say that.
Yeah.
Now that gets back to the cultural question that Samson was raising earlier. So Kant does say that you're going to have different religions in other works, and you're going to have different habits and customs, and they will more or less reflect the moral law. And then what you do about that is, he believes, which is kind of what's happening, that you'll get more and more republics, not kingdoms, that adhere to the notion of universal human dignity, and they will require peace, and so you'll get a more and more League of Nations. That's his term.
Yeah.
And there was a League of Nations, didn't work out so well, had to retire in the late 30s, replaced by the United Nations in 1946 or whatever. And then there will be a united League of Republics. And that's why he writes an essay called Perpetual Peace, like we are gradually moving towards perpetual peace. And now a really big question, which I can't sketch an answer for, Kant in his later essays turns to history as the unfolding of the progress towards a universal republican regimes with individual human rights. Now that he's suggesting that therefore the human race is gradually, incrementally approaching that moral world where everyone acts morally and is not punished for it. They're rewarded for it by peace and so on. But we can never get there, but geometrical progression, you gradually get closer and closer. That's the suggestion. And that gets taken up, obviously, by Hegel, that we are, in theoretical and practical terms, the human race develops through an intelligible process of conflict towards the state where we understand the true principles. The absolute truth is understood by me, GWF Hegel, and we have understood the final political state, which is the modern republic. In his case, he has to pretend that it's a monarchical republic. But yeah, that's it. And now, after 1806, which is when Napoleon invades Prussia, that's it. History's at an end. We've reached the final state, which is when the principles of the French Revolution began to be propagated around the world. But I think I said this in the first class, and if you disagree, I'd be very interested to hear it. But I take it that all notions of inevitable, ineluctable progress that can't go back as completely refuted by the 20th century. I take that it can be completely unthinkable that there is such a thing as an ineluctable, irreversible progress. That's just my assumption, but I'm happy to have that assumption questioned.
And by refuted, you mean by the two world wars?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the crimes associated therein. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just, yeah. I agree. I once read a memoir with a guy who was in they're in the gas chamber. No, they're in the showers as they entered Auschwitz. And, but they don't know it's the showers or the gas. And they have the showers, and one Jewish man says to another, "I cannot believe that this is happening in Germany in 1943.
Yeah.
Like the same way that we say, you can't say that, it's 2025, what are you saying?" Like, just that sense, because, intellectual, well-brought-up people had that sense then as now that there is progress, ineluctable human progress. So how could this be happening? That was possibly not the most inspiriting example that I could have proffered at that moment, but I just want to say one last suggestion. Okay, the formulation that I've arrived at, which may not be useful, so please question it, but for modern thought, is that it substitutes the conditions for excellence and happiness for excellence and happiness. But you start by saying the ends aren't knowable. Like genuine happiness and excellence aren't really knowable, or they're individual, and therefore we can't know them. If something's purely individual, then I can't say anything about it because your happiness is your happiness, my happiness is mine, and so on. So we start from that, and then we say, well, we can focus on the conditions. You can have a bit more wealth, health, you can move freely, etc., etc. But in the end, we substitute those conditions for happiness and excellence. And Kant, I think, prevaricates and does the same, because I've been emphasizing these phrases where he says, this book has the utility of restricting reason in its theoretical sense to preserve morality. And at one point in the B preface, he says, this utility is a positive utility. And it is exactly like, and if someone disagrees with me, Kant, if someone disagrees with me, I would say it's exactly as it has the same positive utility as the police that defend you from bodily harm. But that's a negative utility. That's not a positive. It doesn't make you happy, right? It saves you from grievous harm. That's a good thing. That does have utility, but that's a negative utility. And then in the second section of the canon that we were reading, he says that the Critique of Pure Reason has perhaps only negative utility. And in other places, he just says negative utility. So he's prevaricating between can our philosophy provide a positive utility, or is it merely negative in the sense that it gets rid of obstacles to human happiness and excellence? And I think, to me, that's just a sign of this modern difficulty, that in order to make what is good universal, we substitute the conditions for what's good for the good, and therefore block off aspects of human experience that are essential to human happiness and excellence. If anyone has a refutation, I'm happy to.
Not a refutation, but just going back to the golden rule, because that does seem to be sort of the practical, where he lands practically in terms of what a morality looks like.
Yeah.
But that is, and maybe I'm getting this completely wrong. That is a limitation on morality, as I understand it. It's a rule that says don't make rules unless you really want them to apply to you as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
And that's and Mill actually says this straight out. He says it should actually be. I'm just going to correct this theological text here. It should actually be, don't do what you don't want done to you, which I think I take as an expression of this notion that I'm suggesting, that it's a negative utility.
Yeah. But then doesn't that mean, I mean, that really does open up freedom for to do all sorts of things, because there's no rules against it, because you can't make a rule because it would have to apply to you.
So the problem is that Kant is saying that freedom spontaneously acts in a necessary way.
Yeah.
Like by the concepts of the understanding are applied by a concept is a rule for the application of one representation to a bunch of other representations. The moral law is to act in accordance with morality, is to act such that your action can be summarized, he calls it a maxim, under a universal law. So the real question is, how does freedom become a universal necessary law?
Yeah.
And so people like Nietzsche say, if you're free, it means you're not subject to universal necessary laws. And therefore we can create different values, different moralities, different...
With respect to the other two, there's...
Sorry, Karen, just speak before you... No, please. But I notice it's 2:00.
Oh.
So I'll turn off the recording, and I'll thank you very much for your attention. And but we can keep discussing because I don't think we're going to be thrown out. So please, Cameron.